So welcome everybody. Welcome to Leaders Link. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Melanie Jameson. I'm a partner at Leaders Quest and have the big shoes to fill of Lindsay Levin today, who is taking a very, very well-earned break after Countdown. For those of you who haven't joined Leaders Link before, this is a series of live stream conversations from leaders all around the world. And we invite them to bring different, unique, valuable perspectives on what's going on around us. At Leaders Quest, we've spent 2 decades really thinking about how to help companies align profit with purpose, to think about how to deliver a future where everybody can thrive within the means of the planet. And we know that globally over the last year, the crises we're facing have really increased the need to transform our systems in ways that serve both people and planet. And so our guest today, David Rouch, in his new book, The Social License for Financial Markets, invites us to really think about the assumptions that we've made about the financial system and how we might be able to change the way that we behave in order to deliver a more sustainable future. As well as being an author, he's also very busy as a partner at Freshfields, where he's currently advising the UN Environment Programme and others on the integration of sustainability within the investment chain. So David, welcome to Leaders Link. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
And I'd love to just start by hearing a little bit about your own personal story and what it was that inspired you to write The Social License for Financial Markets.
Yeah, so thank you for that introduction. I'll start with the second half of that question first, if I may. What was it that inspired me? Because essentially it was exactly the issues that you've just been rehearsing. It was becoming increasingly clear to me that humanity is facing some of the toughest and most complex challenges it's ever had to deal with. And financial markets have the potential to help considerably in finding solutions to those challenges. But in order to do that, they need to be working effectively and well. And the question is whether they have been. And I think Mark Carney recognized this issue when back in 2015, he started talking about a social license for financial markets. And he very kindly wrote the foreword for this book. And I think he did that because he recognizes that if we're going to rise to the challenge, some very fundamental behavior change is needed to get markets working sustainably and effectively for all of us. And I think particularly at the moment with COVID-19, we have a real opportunity. It's throwing everything up into the air. The way we socialize, the way we work, the way we see the world. I think we've got a real opportunity to make some simple but widespread changes throughout the financial sector that could really help to reorientate finance in a way that serves the interests of all. Now, that's answering the second part of your question, but there's a crucial first part, which is about me, and that background is also relevant to where the book came from. Because as you said, I started my city life, and I'm still there at Freshfields. Back in the early 90s, I started just after the big bang in the city, deregulation of the city, and I've been working with the finance sector throughout. So through dot-com booms, debt bubbles and bursts, virtualization, internationalization, and of course a massive growth in the financial sector by reference to the whole of the rest of the economy. And then through the financial crisis and everything that followed, up to my neck in salvaging firms and reputations. And then now COVID, sustainable finance, Brexit. So I've seen a lot. But throughout that time, a question has been gnawing away at me, which is a rather existential question if you're a lawyer, which is, are any of the rules that I'm advising on and applying making any real difference to behavior? So you can see that that's quite problematic if you're a lawyer, because if you have this nagging feeling that they're not making an awful lot of difference, you're doing yourself out of a job. And I do have this nagging feeling that they're not making a lot of difference. We've had a raft of regulatory reform since the financial crisis, and it's made some important changes, but it hasn't moved the dial on the sort of issues that we've just been mentioning. So really, I've been looking at this issue throughout my career, which is how do rules change behavior and what really changes behavior? And that work that I've been doing comes together, I think, with this idea of a social license and the challenges that we're now facing, and has resulted in this book, because this book seeks to show not just how rules, but how behavior changes and how rules fit into that.
So I'm just wondering, David, as I read the book, the thing that really struck me was this sense that you were lifting a veil on like a hidden pattern or a hidden fabric, of ways of seeing, of a narrative, of ways of behaving, that become this social license that you describe. And I want to just read a quote that really struck me. The social license for financial markets speaks to the financial ecosystem as a whole and points towards justice as an ultimate end. It incorporates but transcends financial return. And I'm wondering, I'd love you to tell us a bit more about this. I'm sure you've met people who would challenge you on this, and I'd love you to kind of bring this to life for us.
So the really interesting thing, and this is I find this fascinating, I haven't found a single person who has challenged me on that statement, and it just blows me away. Because you might have thought that you would get a lot of pushback, but you haven't. So why is that? Now, I'm certain you're right. I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who would challenge me, but why have I not had more pushback? I think it is because the social license for financial markets helps us to recognize something about ourselves, something about the way we really are, rather than the way that we think we are. And it gives us a language for talking about that, which we don't currently have. So what do I mean by that? So this idea of a social license, I think, is, if you like, an acknowledgement of the reality that for finance to work, it depends on some very, very deep social consensuses. Consensuses like what money is, even. I mean, this is a social construct, and finance relies on a whole host of those understandings. And because it's relying on those, there's a sense in which you can say that finance operators depend on a sort of consent from society in order to do what they do. Now, obviously, there's an element of metaphor about this. And you can think of it a little bit like the sort of license that medics have in the United States. So in the US, for a medic to carry on business, they have to be licensed. And the reason for giving that license is that it's recognized that if they don't do what they do properly, a lot of people are going to get damaged. But as long as they do it properly in accordance with the license, it will be a big social benefit to everyone. And the social license is sort of saying something a little bit like that about finance. It's saying that finance operators are being given a freedom, importantly, it's the grant of a freedom to do something that benefits everyone. Now, of course, finance firms really are licensed. Banks do have regulatory authorizations and they refer to them as licenses. But the interesting thing about talking about a social license for financial markets is people aren't saying, well, finance operators have to go and behave in accordance with their regulatory license. They're talking about a social license. So they're obviously talking about something that goes beyond what we're talking about when we talk about just ordinary legal licenses. So I think what the social license is doing is drawing attention to something that's actually there. We do have a regime of social licenses, but it's reaching beyond that to a wider goal for what finance is all about. And I think that wider goal is ultimately about justice. And the way I explain justice in the book is that I say that justice is really a situation in which every individual in society is able to experience in practice their human dignity to the greatest extent possible. So justice is about a balance in relationships, and essentially the social license is about getting to a balance where every person can enjoy their human dignity to the fullest extent possible. Now, it's therefore saying something about the way markets are, but also about how markets could be at their best and what we aspire to out of markets. And what's important about that is that it cuts right across an existing set of narratives that we apply to financial markets. Because if you talk to most people, markets are this kind of Hobbesian war of all against all, the wolf of Wall Street, everyone's out to make as much money as they possibly can. The reality is, as economists have recognized increasingly over the last couple of decades, that is rubbish. We are not this bunch of money-obsessed psychopaths that traditional economic models have said. And I can tell you, and anyone on this call who thinks about it will be able to tell you, that when people come into their financial firms, they're actually coming with a whole raft of motives, and a very powerful motive they bring is a desire to make a positive difference. And so this social license is about drawing attention to all of that side of what motivates us when we're active in financial markets.
So you, as you talk about that, the aspirational market, if you like, in the book, you talk a lot about the importance of trust and social solidarity, and also about the need for healing in the relationship between finance and society. So can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, of course I can, yeah. So look, after lawyers, bankers are probably the least popular members of society, and they always have been. I'm under no illusion about lawyers, but bankers are probably second in public opprobrium. But after the financial crisis, that kind of skyrocketed. Lawyers were temporarily displaced as the most unpopular members of society by bankers. And I think actually the bankers are still bottom of the league at the moment. Now, fairly or not, the finance sector was seen as having wreaked massive social damage. And that in turn resulted in a huge loss of trust towards the financial sector. Now, the difficulty with losing trust is that when people's trust is dented, they can also lose the ability to trust. So it's not just that they lose their trust in particular individuals, but it undermines their capacity for trust. And as a result, mistrust can spread around the system. And that is exactly what happened after the financial crisis. It migrated around the system. And unfortunately, petrol was dumped on the fire by some serious scandals in other sectors. We had the famous House of Commons scandal of MPs' expenses in the UK, people claiming expenses for duck houses in the middle of ponds and goodness knows what else. We've had the Volkswagen scandal and so forth. So this loss of trust, which started perhaps in the financial sector, although I think it was there before the financial crisis, has migrated so that it's undermining trust in social institutions, political institutions, and the economic system generally. Now, some of that's not necessarily a bad thing. If we have untrustworthy elements in the system, it's good that they're exposed because we can do something about it. The danger is if the mistrust, the loss of trust, starts to undermine the very infrastructure on which we depend to address those challenges. When it starts to destroy social solidarity, because social solidarity is utterly dependent on trust. You cannot have social solidarity if we don't trust each other. So if that trust starts to undermine the very fabric that we rely upon to sort out our challenges, then we have a real problem. Now, that is a problem I don't think the financial sector on its own can address, but it's part of the solution. And I think this idea of a social license can help to begin to reorient financial activity so that people can see that finance operators are trustworthy and do deserve trust. And trust takes a lot longer to rebuild than to lose, but I think that is the beginning of a long process. And unfortunately, I think it is a long process.
Mm. So I'd love to just reflect something back as I think about that response. And David, please tell me if this sort of resonates with what you've just said. But I guess my sense is that um, in reading the book and becoming more aware of this license that is often hidden from view, but very deeply interconnected with our behaviors, by becoming aware of the aspirational intention of that license, if you like,
Hmm.
what are the subtle shifts that that awareness starts to create? How does that recognition of that license start to transform the hearts and mind and actions that we take in order to start to rebuild that trust,
Yeah.
in order to start to heal that relationship?
Okay, so you used a really powerful expression there, because you just referred to hearts and minds. And the critical thing about changing behavior in the banking sector so it's a lot more trustworthy, changing behavior so that we address our sustainability challenges through the finance sector more effectively, that all requires behavior change. And if you want to change behavior, you have to change hearts and minds. Hearts and minds drive behavior. So the key thing about the social license is that I think it has the capacity to engage hearts and minds, to do exactly that kind of work. But legal rules can do that. I mean, legal rules can change behavior, and that is the usual lever that we all run to. So if you talk to politicians, all they're interested in, frankly, is, well, what's the policy ask? What can I do? What rule can I introduce? But the reality is that we have to reach beyond that. That's important, but it's only going to make a change if we reach beyond that to what motivates people. Now, great leaders throughout history have recognized that if you want to engage hearts and minds, one of the most powerful ways of doing it is by using narratives that touch on these deepest aspirations that we have for the way that life should be. And in particular, they have very often appealed to people's sense of justice. It's one of the most powerful motivations that we have. So if you look at Abraham Lincoln, which is one of my favorite examples at Gettysburg, this is exactly what he's doing in the Gettysburg Address. He essentially, that speech is about, it's addressed to a nation that's absolutely riven by dispute. It's a dispute over markets, among other things. Interesting enough, the markets in cotton and human beings. And what does he use to try to draw the threads together, to draw those disparate elements of American society that he was addressing together? He is essentially appealing, although he doesn't use the words, to the desire for human dignity to be realized in practice. Now, he doesn't use that word. He puts it in terms of freedom, but that is actually what he's getting at. Because for him, freedom is how you realize the fullness of what it is to be a human, I think, in the context of that speech anyway. So now a narrative like that engages hearts and minds. It works a little bit like the plot line in a movie. You get drawn into the narrative. So if you look at what he's doing there, he's drawing in different constituencies that he's speaking to. He's weaving together individual stories into an overarching national story of national destiny. And indeed, his speech has, some people would say, defined the century that followed in some ways. And I think the social license has that sort of narrative quality. It has the ability, it's talking about aspiration. It focuses attention on a similar sort of end. And so I think it has the narrative quality to do a similar work to speeches like that, to operate like the sort of movie script, as it were. Now, crucially, the book shows how that can displace the kind of narratives that I was talking about earlier, because those narratives that assume we're all money-grabbing psychopaths have a similar power over us at the moment. And what I think we need is a counter-narrative that begins to displace them and get us to a place that is much truer to the sort of people that we really are. When you see how people really behave, when you see what they really want, I think this social license is true. It doesn't displace the importance of financial return. It recognizes that it's really important. You cannot realize human dignity, particularly in market economies, unless people can earn a salary. So finance is really important, but it focuses attention on something beyond that, that's defined in terms of human value. Now, Why does that make a behavioural difference? Well, three reasons. And I sum them up in this way: focus, framing, and forming. It does three things, a narrative like this. It focuses desire. It draws attention to some desires that we bring to financial markets rather than others. So I'm not saying we don't bring the desire for money to financial markets. I'm saying we bring lots of other desires as well. And this social license brings to life a whole set of desires that don't often get given sufficient voice. And they're like muscles. Desires are like muscles. The more you exercise them, the stronger they become. So if we're not exercising those desires, those aspirations, they wither. Second, framing. When we pursue our desires, we do so by reference to the world as we understand it to be. We think, I want to achieve that. This is the landscape that confronts me. And given these assumptions, I have to do this, this, and this to get there. Now, if the landscape that we face is framed in one way, we will make one sort of decisions. And if it's framed in another way, we'll make another set of decisions. And what I'm arguing in the book is that the social license for financial markets gives us a much truer framing of reality for those sorts of decisions. But thirdly, and most importantly, forming. As people behave in accordance with their aspirations by reference to their understanding of the world as it is framed, they are formed. So individual character is formed, institutional culture is formed. And the way those two things are formed determines our future behavior. And this is really, really important, because so much of our behavior isn't driven by our conscious thought processes. It's driven by habit. It's driven by just assumptions about the way things are, and almost a sort of a motorized way of responding to reality. And even the most conscious decisions that we make rest on a whole bed of non-conscious assumptions. And this is why when people talk about changing financial institutions, or indeed any institution, any business, they always talk of it in terms of being a long-term process, because habits take a very long time to change. So focus, framing, and forming, those are the things that I think this new narrative can help us to really energize.
So I'd love to pick up on some of what you've said and start to focus on applying this in the real world. And kind of two questions around that. The first, as you know, our work at Leaders Quest is very much about helping companies align purpose and profit. And I'd love to find out from you what your research and findings have told you about working with purpose at the organizational level, and what it takes to truly create the systems change that I think many of us are seeking.
Well, I mean, it says masses that is relevant to that. But perhaps if I sort of pick up on two themes in the book. The first is about ecosystems and systemic change, and the second is about this balancing of financial and non-financial goals, because both of those are very important in institutional change. Now, the first thing that is important here is recognizing that institutions function as part of an ecosystem. Now, whether you're talking about a bank in the financial system, or whether you're talking about an oil company in a different system, they are operating within an ecosystem. And the ability of an institution to change depends not just on what's going on within the institution, but also what is going on within the ecosystem. And the important thing about the social license for financial markets, as far as a financial institution is concerned, is that it addresses the entire ecosystem, not just institutions, but individuals as well, and the ecosystem as a whole. And it points towards a systemic purpose for all of it. And a single institution is not going to get purpose right if its purpose is not adequately aligned with systemic purpose, or if the systemic purpose cuts across what that institution thinks its purpose is. So if the institution concludes that its purpose is socially orientated, but the system it's operating in just doesn't recognize that, it's going to find it very difficult to realize that in practice, not least because its own employees won't share that vision, because the system is telling them that isn't what it's about. So I think finding a way to get this sort of coordinated change across ecosystems is really important, and it's one of the most I think one of the most important contributions that recognition of a social license can make. But the second thing it can do, I think, is help us navigate this really difficult challenge, and it is so difficult, of how you approach financial goals and non-financial goals at the same time. Because, when we talk about profit and purpose, profit is a purpose. So we're actually using purpose as a euphemism for something else. We're not actually really talking just about purpose. We're talking about a purpose that transcends profit. And what the social license helps us to recognize, I think, is that profit is a goal, it is a purpose, but it's an instrumental purpose. It's instrumental in achieving a higher purpose. And I think the framework of the social license just helps us to begin to navigate how you mesh those things together. And a lot of people are converging on this sort of ground at the moment. They're trying to find a language and a framework for doing it. You've got integrated reporting, you've got the whole US Business Roundtable discussion of purpose, you've got similar stuff going on in the UK. But I just don't think, when I look at it, we've quite got a framework for navigating it. And I think in financial markets, at least, the social license can help with that, although I think it's got relevance even beyond financial markets myself.
Great, David. I'm really want to ask one more question and then hand to the group. So just an invitation to everybody who's joining us today to use the chat box if you'd like to share a question, and we'll call on some people in a moment. But David, it'd be great to sort of build on what we've just been talking about in terms of organizational purpose or higher purpose, and step out in, what does this really mean in the real world? What kind of impact could it create? And maybe just give us a little bit of a secret view of some of the stuff that you're working on at the moment that could come to fruition.
Yeah, so starting at the highest level, I think everyone's probably got what the ultimate goal is to sort of reorientate everyone's perspective throughout the ecosystem, so that we're much more socially orientated in every single financial decision we make, in every business decision we make. We're always looking beyond that decision to its wider impact on human good. But of course, that is very, very, very high level. So you always need to bring this down several levels. And I do that in chapter 7 of the book. I give a whole raft of ways in which this could influence policy in practice and corporate practice. But let me just home in on one that I'm working on, which does indeed correspond with this UN project that you mentioned at the beginning, because I'm giving some advice to the UN Environment Programme and others on how you can reorientate the investment process so that it isn't just focused on earning a financial return, but it also seeks to positively impact some of those sustainability challenges that I was mentioning at the beginning. Now, until fairly recently, the systemic narrative in the finance sector was that investment is all about making money. That's all it's about. If you're an asset manager, you have to make the most risk, you have to achieve the most effective risk-return ratio for your client given their financial objective. But what we're increasingly finding as a result of the whole sustainability debate, but also as a result of loads of surveys now of investors, is that isn't actually all we want out of finance. We actually want finance that, in investment, that does good as well as earning a good return. In other words, actually makes a positive impact. Now, that's not the same as ethical investing, because ethical investing is simply not holding investments that you don't particularly like for one reason or another. You know, they are polluting or they involve tobacco. But what this project is about is how the investment process can actually change that. Now, investment return is clearly very important. Indeed, it is fundamental to sustainability for those whose pensions depend on it. However, that's not all it's about. And I think in order to bring in this other set of goals, we need a rather different framework from the one that we've been operating under. And the social license provides just that kind of framework. And it does it, I guess, in three ways. As we've been saying, it draws attention to the wider goals that we have, so it focuses our aspirations, but it can also change individual and corporate culture in the way that we've just been discussing. But finally, and importantly, in terms of hard practical policy steps, it can also provide a way of navigating the policy process, the change, the new legal rules that would be needed to realize this. Because at the moment, you see, the legal regime assumes exactly what the prevailing narrative assumes. Laws assume that investment management is just about making money for the people that, for pensioners, for fund holders and so forth. And indeed, because they assume that, they require those who are managing money to pursue that goal. They simply don't address any other goals in the investment process, such as sustainability outcomes. So the suggestion, or one of the suggestions I make in the book, and that we're looking at in the context of this UN report, is, well, so how about if we upend that assumption and we say, as increasing amounts of research suggest, people don't actually just want to make as much money as possible when they invest, they want to do good as well. And we assume, and we tell people throughout the financial system who are managing money that they are to assume that their investors want to do good as well as earning a good return in the way their money is invested. Now that fundamentally changes the way in which huge pots of money that have a massive impact on the realization of sustainability outcomes, that has a profound impact on the way that money gets managed, and begins to help us to deal with some of the sustainability challenges that I mentioned. Now, we've got precedent for this in the UK. In the UK, we have this regime, a kidney donor regime, that essentially assumes at the moment that if you die, when you die, you are presumed to want to donate your kidneys to people who need them, unless you opt out. So what we're saying is you'd have something similar, an assumption built in to financial law that says that people want, that you are to assume that people want their money to be managed in this way unless they opt out of it. You would always have to give them the ability to opt out, of course. So that's an example of how this could be really bedded down into the nitty-gritty of investment practice in a way that would directly start to affect sustainability outcomes.
Great, thank you, David. So we're getting some questions streaming in. And Zofnat, forgive me if I don't get your name correct. Would you like to just take yourself off mute and just briefly share your question, if that's okay? Thank you.
Sure, I relied on you. Thank you, David. Sorry. My first speech in the morning. I am on the West Coast. I'm sorry. So yeah, I've been researching and practicing. I'm a psychologist, conflict engagement, I like to say, professional. And I've been working on transforming our habitual ways of being. And you were talking about that, exactly. And you mentioned the 3 F's, and I'm talking about insight and action. We have to incorporate both the change in perception as to how we are in the world today, how we treat others, self-others relationships, and how we desire to be. And I am very much inspired by Buber, I-thou relationship.
Oh, yeah.
and it's impossible in a Western monologic individualist social structure. So now so I've been dealing with that for 2 decades. And my question to you, one of the main, we need the leaders to lead this change, because they are very comfortable in wherever they are, financially and not financially. So what could be the incentive for those leaders to help us to make the change? And how can they see that incentive? Even if we recognize the incentive, how they can see the incentive and help us to pull it together?
Yeah, fantastic question. I mean, so I think some of them get it, because one of them obviously did the foreword for my book. Mark Carney, clearly gets this. And I suppose one of the things that gives me hope is that when I've engaged on this book, and I've engaged now with quite a few people since it was published in July, I have consistently found that it has resonated with the way people feel, the way people want their jobs to be, the way people want their world to be. And I know that politicians and leaders, are subject to a whole series of pressures and have to deal with electorates and risks, but ultimately they are people as well, and they do experience these things. I've got a few friends who are in these positions, and I know they do. And I guess it goes back to this sort of ecosystem point. Individual politicians are not going to move on their own. They kind of need something made visible to them as well, to know that they can move, and they need to see it beginning to shift in other areas. And there is no doubt, I think. I mean, when I started writing this book, it was nowhere near as clear as it is now. But now, particularly post-COVID, there is no doubt that things are moving. I mean, there is a huge shift now underway. And so I think there are huge risks. There are things that scare me rigid about what's going on at the moment. But I'm also very optimistic, because I think a lot of what I'm talking about in the book is becoming clearer to people. And I hope that will inspire politicians to take risks. I think it does need courage and risks, but I hope it will inspire them to take those risks. So far, the reception I've had to the book sort of has not dented my confidence, shall we say.
Great, thank you, David. We've got a couple of questions that I'm just going to take the liberty of merging the two and invite you maybe just to take 2 minutes to respond before we come to a close. One is from Adiba, which you'll see in the chat, and I'm just going to say this sounds similar to the debate on whether a company's obligation is to maximize stakeholder versus shareholder returns. Do you agree, or are there key differences? And the thing I'm just going to add in there as a bit of a nuance is to say, you talked about hearts and minds earlier, and I'm just wondering, for you in your own personal journey, has there been something that has transformed your own heart and mind, and particularly perhaps in response to this question about maximizing stakeholder and shareholder returns, because I know you talk about that in the book?
Wow, that's the big question right at the end. I wasn't expecting that one. Well, let's start with Adiba. Yes, shareholder value is one of the big myths, I think, about the corporate world that is in the process of being dismantled. And I think the social license helps us I actually think the social license helps us to leapfrog the stakeholder debate. I think the stakeholder debate is positive in many ways, but I think it takes us into a contested and conflictual environment where a company gets treated like a pie to be cut up and shared out between various stakeholders. And I don't think that is how we should approach the company. I think we should approach the company as a cooperative venture that gives to everyone. And I worry, I think the stakeholder debate has been very valuable. I think that, it really has helped, but I think we now need to move beyond it. because I think we're getting a little bit locked into something that's rather conflictual. But yes, it's very relevant to that debate. In terms of me, I think I would struggle to put my finger on one single thing. I think, you know, throughout one's life, there are influences that come to bear on you that give you a passion for things. I mentioned, for example, in the introduction to the book, my dear history teacher, Keith Baker, who died while I was writing the book, in fact, because I'm very disappointed because I want to give him a copy. But anyway, he gets a mention instead. And you know, right the way through from my parents all the way through. And I think this is important because it does show us the magnitude of the challenge that we're dealing with, because human behavior is multi-layered. And by the time people come into financial markets or any market, a certain amount of bedrock has already been laid. I think if you were to ask me what have been some of the most significant influences more recently in the way that I've understood this, I think two of the most exciting thinkers that I've come across, and in a way I was introduced to the second through the first, is the philosopher Charles Taylor, Canadian philosopher. I think he's now in his early 90s, amazing guy, really interesting ideas, which I talk about him in chapter 6 a certain amount, but also through him, Pierre Bourdieu and his ideas on a concept called habitus, which just seemed to me to really chime with the way I kind of understand the world. But I think what's in some ways what's influenced me most is having just niggling away at this question. I don't know why I'm the sort of person who just doesn't sort of let these questions rest, but it's niggling away at this idea, do rules actually make a difference? And it's kind of grown out of that. So I don't know. Perhaps someone on the call can tell me why it is that I fret about such things, but I think that has been quite an important motivation in all of this.
Great, thank you. Well, that we can pick up on that next time we speak.
Yeah.
We're going to come to a close because I know that you probably have another Zoom call to jump onto. But thank you so much for joining us. Please look up David's book. It's quite helpful. It gives you some great snapshots at the start of each chapter to really help those of us who are not financially minded find their way through it. Please join us for the next Leaders Link, which will be 2 days after the US election. We won't be covering it here. And we'll be joined by Charlotte City Council member Braxton Winston and LQ associate Jimmy Briggs. So we hope we can see you then. Thank you all. Have a good rest of the day. Thanks for being with us.